Welcome to the Cultural Revolution Module 2. In this video, we're going to cover the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 all the way up until 1972. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder of our major questions. What was the Cultural Revolution? The second question is, who was responsible for the Cultural Revolution? The third question is, what were the origins of the Cultural Revolution? And then finally, what were the long-term consequences of the Cultural Revolution for China and the rest of the world? Now for the questions specific to this module. The first question is, when did the Cultural Revolution begin? Who launched it and why? The second question is, why did so many Chinese citizens go along with the Cultural Revolution? And the theme for this module is political rivalries and popular energy. Picking things up from the end of the Great Leap Forward, which, if you remember, was an absolute disaster for the People's Republic of China, the years between 1961 and 1965 actually saw China start to bounce back. Only this time it wasn't under Mao's leadership, it was under Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping's leadership. Under their leadership, agricultural production bounced back in the People's Republic of China. In fact, grain output was up significantly by 1965. Urban industrial production also bounced back. Industrial production grew at an annual rate of roughly 11%, and cities once again began to grow very quickly. The countryside again began to grow very slowly, and this troubled Mao. But remember, Mao has been largely sidelined since the failure of the Great Leap Forward. He's still an important person in the party, but he isn't consulted much when it came to political decision-making. This led Mao to believe that many people in the party treated him like a dead ancestor, someone who was revered, but not someone that you actually needed to consult. He often complained that Deng Xiaoping actually never came to consult him about anything. Mao was also starting to believe that he was being widely criticized. There was a popular play at the time written by a man named Wu Han. The play was called Hai Rei Dismissed from Office. The play was about a Ming official who went against the orders of the emperor, basically to do what was best for the people. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and another man named Yao Wenyuan argued that the play was an attack on Mao. They made the case that the play was a critique on Mao's handling of the Great Leap Forward. They argued that Mao was the bad emperor and that Peng Dehuai, the Chinese general who confronted Mao at the Lushan plenum, was Hai Rei. The Cultural Revolution began in late 1965, early 1966 as a movement to remake China's culture. But what it really boiled down to was an effort to neutralize Mao's enemies. While millions of Chinese people eagerly took part in this movement to remake China's culture, it was hard to see that a lot of it revolved around attacking Mao's enemies. Having been sidelined for years and feeling as though people in the Chinese Communist Party were beginning to attack him, Mao began the process of attacking his political enemies, beginning with Wu Han, the person who wrote Hai Rei Dismissed from Office. Beginning in 1965 and 1966, Wu Han and his play were attacked in political essays by Yao Wenyuan. Also attacked was Liu Reiqing. He's the guy on the bottom left. He had over 40 years of service to the CCP, and he had a long military history. His crimes were anti-party activity, and he was treated so poorly after being accused that he attempted suicide. Peng Zhen, he's the guy on the top left, was also attacked. Like Liu, he had 40 years of service to the CCP. His crime was just being an associate of Wu Han. Unfortunately, some of the most powerful people in the People's Republic of China did not intervene to save Liu Reiqing or Peng Zhen. The Politburo Standing Committee, which consisted of some of the most powerful people in China, including Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, and Deng Xiaoping, failed to intervene, in part because they didn't believe that the movement which was starting to take place involved them, and they thought that Once these people were criticized, things would go back to normal. Ultimately, this is how phase one of the Cultural Revolution played out. This was the beginning. While the movement may have started as something of an attempt by Mao to get back at a small number of his political rivals, it didn't stay that way. By mid May of 1966, the Cultural Revolution entered a distinctly popular phase. And by that, I mean it spread to the Chinese people. One of the first places where you saw the Cultural Revolution rear its head was on university campuses throughout China. These posters became vehicles through which the Cultural Revolution moved. As they appeared on campuses, people would create the posters to attack people who had wronged them in the past, real or imagined. Looking back at the first big character poster, published on May 25th, 1966, that was one student who was upset with university administrators, most notably the president of Beijing University, for, quote unquote, suppressing student discussions of the Wuhan affair. As university administrators, teachers, and local officials were increasingly attacked by students and workers throughout China through these big character posters and sometimes physically, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping attempted to control the growing Cultural Revolution by dispatching work teams to the universities. These work teams were individuals who were supposed to guide and control student discussions to keep them under control. Unfortunately, the Cultural Revolution only deepened. Millions of students began forming a group known as the Red Guard. Now, this isn't really one singular group. This is actually thousands of smaller groups that devoted themselves absolutely to protecting Mao and defending the Cultural Revolution. A lot of the violence of the Cultural Revolution, the murders, the beatings, these can be attributed to the Red Guard. They were absolutely devoted to Mao, and in defense of the Cultural Revolution, they were prepared to do almost anything. As the work teams worked to bring the students under control, Mao penned a letter titled "Bombard the Headquarters" in August 1966. If you look at the images on the left, you can see images of students wearing military uniforms, holding weapons, and on the bottom right, attacking individuals. This was a distinctive feature of the second phase, or the Red Guard phase, of the Cultural Revolution. It was marked by violence carried out by millions of students and millions of workers attacking people of authority. All in all, what these students were doing was following Mao's orders. He told them in Bombard the Headquarters to attack political figures and people of authority from the central down to the local level. That means from the most important centers of power in Beijing all the way down to the smallest official at the local level. But the orders were often vague. Anyone that was perceived to be standing in the way of Mao's Cultural Revolution was now an enemy of the people. These students now believed that it was justified to rebel, and along with their rebellious nature, they were given free travel throughout the country. And as they moved throughout the country, they did a lot of things. They attacked all those people who were enemies of the state or enemies of the people, but they also moved to destroy the four olds. That meant old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. In just a few short years, China lost many of its most precious historical artifacts and buildings as these students moved throughout the country, destroying anything that they thought was a marker of the old Chinese culture. But why would anyone start such a destructive movement? It really wasn't clear to many people at the time. What really all of this boiled down to was settling old scores. While the Red Guard may have seemed like an uncontrollable force of nature, they revered one man, Mao Zedong. They would do whatever they could to attack Mao's political rivals, and attack they did. Before long, it became clear that the Cultural Revolution was turning against two very powerful people, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Now remember, these were the people who took control after Mao was sidelined in the early 1960s. Deng Xiaoping, he's the guy on the right, and he's a little older in this picture than the one I showed you before, was eventually deposed in 1969 and sent to work in a tire factory. Liu Shaoqi, If you remember him, he's the guy on the left. He was accused of being an enemy of the people. He was subsequently denounced, imprisoned, beaten, denied medical attention, and eventually dies in November of 1969. The two most powerful people who had taken control after Mao's failed Great Leap Forward were now either sent off to the countryside or dead. That said, the Cultural Revolution also claimed one of Mao's most important political allies, Lin Biao. He's the guy on the top left. Lin was one of Mao's most trusted military leaders. He was a key component of helping Mao develop his cult of personality, especially within the military. By 1970, most of Mao's political enemies have been either controlled or eliminated, so Mao shifts to rebuilding the Chinese Communist Party and much of the country. In order to do so, he has to tone down the Cultural Revolution. Unfortunately for Lin, Lin continues to push for the Cultural Revolution full bore. Lin is eventually accused of obstructing Mao's process of rebuilding the country and the party, and he's eventually accused of attempting to assassinate Mao in July of 1972. After being accused of trying to assassinate Mao, Lin flees the People's Republic of China, heading for the Soviet Union. Unfortunately for Lin, his plane crashes under mysterious circumstances over Mongolia. So, by 1972, the Cultural Revolution had been a movement to remake China's culture anew. But covertly, it was also a movement to restore Mao's power and authority amongst the party and in the Chinese government. All in all, roughly 3 million party and government officials lost their jobs during the Cultural Revolution, and as many as 500,000 people, if not more, were killed during the Cultural Revolution or committed suicide due to the political pressure. In conclusion, I'm going to leave you with our questions. The most important question for you to consider in this module is, when did the Cultural Revolution begin, who launched it, and why? In order to answer this question, you'll need to think back across all of the slides that we've covered in this module, but a good place to start is with Hai Rui dismissed from office, Wuhan's play.